Thank you guys for coming. It's so nice to see so many new faces and familiar faces. And as she said, I'm Dr. Kenneth Proefrock. I'm here from Arizona. We have a multidisciplinary clinic. We have 5 physicians at our place. We primarily do naturopathic medical services for people, mostly pediatric neurology. Lots of kids with brain injuries. Some of you have been to our place and some of you haven't. So just in interest of kind of what we do and how we work that, and we'll kind of intermingle that with as we discuss things, is just essentially meeting people where they are and figuring out ways to help humans get to a better place. And part of that concept is this idea of neuroplasticity. And so there's a lot of lip service that's done towards neuroplasticity in this world. And so what I'd like to do is kind of chunk it into some pieces that I think make it a little bit more workable for people, and to make us realize that every minute of your day, you are making a new nervous system. And there's a pretty predictable process that goes through, which is pretty well established. And it starts with the fact that we all remodel our brains throughout our entire lifetimes, no matter what. And that remodeling process happens in a particular way. It is that there is a flush of neurons. Some of those neurons get to stay. Some of those neurons get culled away for the next flush. And essentially, life is basically flushing neurons. Some stick, some don't. And over time, you have this elaborate network that is pretty vast. What I just told you is very oversimplified, right? And so as we get into the weeds, what we're trying to accomplish is essentially how do we conduct ourselves on a daily basis that affects our remodeling in one way or another. Because believe it or not, your Mondays are what create your Wednesdays. And you're not the same person that you were yesterday, today. And you're certainly not the same person you were 5 years ago. When a child has a neurologic injury, whether that's a birth injury or a near-fatal drowning or a blunt trauma, they're especially not the same today as they were prior to their injury. However, there's a core element to who that person is, and they remain that person. That is part of the wonder and redundancy of our human brains. An important element, though, a really important element, and this is true of whether you're making buildings or brains, and it is that the raw materials that you use to build that architecture will determine the quality of that architecture. So the place that we generally start with families is talking to them about food and about nutrition. Nutrition is a sensory event, right? When you eat food, you're both in the midst of other people. There's a social part of it, but there's also a taste, flavor, smells associated with the food. And at times, just problematically, mouths don't work so well, so we've got to put things in through a G-tube. Now we've lost a huge part of the sensory input into our world. So we encourage families, even when they have a G-tube, is don't stop tasting things. Don't stop putting things in a person's mouth. If they aren't able to swallow safely at this point in time, you can still taste some things. A pickle, a lemon, a popsicle, just little things. It doesn't have to be a huge thing, but we want it to be as consistent as possible. And make no mistake, we have come to a realization that ultra-processed food is really a problem for people. Ultra-processed food is not good food, and is not good raw materials for making the architecture of a brain. There are no formulas that aren't processed foods. Formulas are tricky things. There's supposed to be a duplication of other food that you would put into nutrition for a body. And the unfortunate part of that is a lot of that is dominated by companies that aren't really that interested in good quality ingredients. There are a few companies, which you'll meet here, which make better products than what is on the market generally. But by and large, formulas are junk food. And so, how do we get around this? Because this is part of an industry that we get mainstreamed into when our child has a neurologic injury or is born with a trauma that is seemingly inescapable, because as you're in the hospital setting, here are the products that have a place in that hospital setting. Why do those products have a place in the hospital setting? Is it because they're the best, least expensive products in the world for your child? That's not how that decision gets made. Nestle dominates the baby food industry and the formula industry. They're not the only player, but they determine slotting strategies for why something ends up in your local hospital, but may not end up in the hospital down the road. So as parents, it's incumbent on us to try to figure out, how do we do a better job of feeding our children? Because care and feeding of children isn't rocket science. You know how to do this. We all know that even the inset on the commercials on the television that tell you that cereal is part of a balanced breakfast, that a glass of orange juice, some toast, and some cereal is not a balanced breakfast. That we have a world that's dominated by things like Pop-Tarts and cold cereal. That's because our children are marketed to early on in life. I was marketed to. You all were marketed to, right? We had Saturday morning cartoons. And what you wanted that cereal that those happy kids on the TV had. You want those toys that the happy kids on TV have. You want all those things, and it's in your head from the time you're 3 years old that you might need something else, and you might need something else. We are trained to be consumers from an early time. And then it's a matter of what do you have to choose from to consume. Quality, in the case of building a new brain, makes a difference because 90% of that neural architecture is going to be laid down by the time a child is 5. If we built that architecture on chicken nuggets, cheese crisps, and cold cereal, we didn't make very good structures. It's important. And sometimes it's as simple as taking a little bit of sweet potato and adding it to the formula and putting it through the G-tube. We're not talking rocket science. We're just saying, hey, one of the failings of some formulas is that they don't really have any kind of a soluble fiber component, so they don't feed anything in your microbiome at all. And your microbiome is a pretty important part of how you digest food and how you understand the world that you live in. And so we say, stir with a little bit of sweet potato. Put a little butter in there. See how that goes. See how the patient does. Life is a grand experiment. But we have to take the most complex structure that we can understand in this universe, and by the way, we don't understand it, and we have to feed it well so that it can do the best job for us possible, especially because we are going to go through stages of development through our lifetime. And as we go through those stages of development, our needs are going to be somewhat different each time with each unfolding stage. We know that human brain development has a pattern that it emerges with. It's a pretty remarkably consistent pattern. And then things can happen somewhere in the process that will disrupt that pattern. But in this proliferation and pruning process, the simpler neural connections, they get laid down, and then the rest of the neural connections get laid down around them. What's important for our purposes is to understand that process, and we're going to go into that process in a lot more detail, it involves the formation of little microtubules and then some current, some electrical current coming across those little microtubules. Microscopic. If enough current comes on that structure, it will consolidate it and it'll hold it. And that now is a new neuronal connection. If there's not enough current, it won't stick. You won't have a connection. If there's too much current, you fried the circuit, and it's not going to work either. So there's this Goldilocks phenomenon, which is there's a point where things flow well, there's the right amount of current. When you have inflammation in a brain, that disrupts that whole process. Some areas are getting too much current, and some areas are not getting any current at all. So what happens is you get a distorted development to a nervous system. We still go through these stages, right? No matter what, they might be truncated. One of our favorite examples is Debbie Tanaka writes about a study that was done in Sweden back in the late 90s, where they took children who were brand new, born into the world, and found that if they find themselves within 18 inches of mom's face in the first 12 hours of life, that starts a whole pattern recognition cascade in their brain that allows them a facial recognition process. So that now they recognize mom, but they also recognize all the other people that are in their face regularly. Fathers, siblings, caregivers, grandma, grandpa, whoever and whatever. Those children, for whatever reason, that don't get that impact in the first 12 hours, it takes them 22 months to get to that same place. Importantly, they'll get there. They will get there. We just need to set the stage so that that happens as expediently as possible for them, and understand that just because we missed that window doesn't mean we won't have another window coming up. It's also why we see that one of the best things that can happen to a child that has had a brain injury is to have a sibling that's younger than them. Because a lot of times as the younger sibling goes through their stages of development, they will trigger the stages of development in the older sibling that missed that window. It's important also because we are a community. We are not just the individual who has the damage, and we're not just the parents trying to manage that situation. Now, I started doing pediatric neurology about 30 years ago, and I will say that there's been a really, really stark change in the way that that happens. It wasn't that long ago where if your child had a brain injury or was born with some trauma, that you were sort of left to your own devices. You know, here, your child's alive, good luck with things, and people go back to their community. And a lot of times that's an isolating kind of a phenomenon. People didn't have a lot of resources to draw from. There wasn't really an internet. There wasn't this swell of information that comes from parents. And what we see over time is families, especially through social media and organizations like Team Luke, and people get to communicate with one another. And now someone's like, hey, my child had that same diagnosis. We did this, and we did that, and we did this. And here's where we are now. And people are like, oh, you mean there's options? Because we weren't told there was options. And now pretty soon people are sharing their options, going, yeah, actually this worked out pretty well. That worked out pretty well. This didn't work out so well, but we tried this instead. And there's a beauty in that, because absolutely not spawned by neurology, spawned by parents, we have gone from, when I started teaching pediatric neurology, we had a spiral-bound notebook that was paperback. The students were thrilled because it was their cheapest textbook. Now, we've got a thing that's like this, and it's a tome, and really most of that information has been generated over the last 15 years from parent requests, parents wanting people to do more and pushing that edge of understanding. So that's you guys. That's you guys having a conversation, putting your heads together, because maybe one of you is a really great cook, and maybe one of you is really great at coming up with innovative activities for your child, and together you're like, hey, let's change some things about mealtime. And you come up with some pretty great ideas, because you're put up against the wall, and necessity is the mother of invention. And so most of the great things that have happened in pediatric neurology over the last 15 to 20 years have been sparked by parental interest, absolutely not by neurological interest, because there's no money in it. An important part of this is to understand, too, that there are patterns that emerge. They're not unique to any particular individual. But one of the things that we see is at the very beginning of trauma, especially when we're talking about a birth trauma, the first few years, everybody's on board and things are going well. And then by the time you reach this age of somewhere between 6 and 10, things tend to plateau a little bit. We tell parents, don't get discouraged. This body has to take a lot of resources and put it into things like growing, which may be very unfortunate depending on your dystonia situation. However, that's the way that bodies work. And so it doesn't mean that the story's over. Once you start hitting prepubertal and pubertal times, bam, we start having some acceleration of growth and development again, and a desire for more socialization. This is an ongoing process, right? You can be damaged when you're 3, and you're still struggling with some things when you're 30. Part of our task is to make it so that that's less the case. Now, as we understand how these emerging patterns occur, now interventions can be done to say, hey, let's change this today so that in 10 years, this isn't more of a problem. Because here's what statistically we know about that and about this. So don't ever lose your hope for change. Remember, these brains remodel their entire lifetimes. We don't ever stop remodeling. They did a study with some 80-year-olds a few years ago. They said, hey, it turns out 80-year-olds remodel their brains just about as fast as 24-year-olds do. That was a surprise. There's not a real net change in remodeling because they're not doing a lot of new things. If you put them in a new environment and force them to do some new things, then they start exhibiting those changes. Life is a sensory experience. And because of that, when we talk about these flush of neurons, so let's say under normal circumstances, 25% of those neurons that get flushed and connect, they actually get to stay. Now you've made some kind of 25% change in that network. What if you could do things that would increase that to 35%, to 50%, to 80%? What if there's activities and ideas, thoughts that could go about a brain that would increase the amount of connections that get made every time you have this flush of neurons? That's our task, right? It's sensory feedback that consolidates the new neurons. So when those baby connections get made and they're looking for that right amount of current to make them stay, that right amount of current comes in from experience, from sensory input, from the soft caress on a shoulder, from a hug from your grandma, from the smell of chocolate chip cookies in your kitchen. Those are all things that go into making a nervous system. Here's what's amazing about our nervous systems, is that they are exactly a model of all of our experiences. Because it is that input, that sensory input, that literally determines which of the new connections are going to stay and which ones aren't going to stay. The sensory input can be positive. The sensory input can be negative. If you're in pain, you're in isolation, you are frustrated, those are things that influence your remodeling. Versus if you're comfortable, if you're secure, if your belly feels okay. These are things that also foster remodeling. And ultimately, as a living organism on planet Earth, our number one first responsibility is to determine, is our world a safe place? Is our world an unsafe place? To what degree is it safe or unsafe? Because now we need to adjust the way that we are in order to make sure that we survive. And survival becomes the first. And so sensory input, we talk about people through history who've identified that, especially as it pertains to movement and mobility, these are brilliant people. Ida Rolf, are you guys familiar with this name? Ida was a PhD physical therapist in the 1960s, some version of hell, because she was brilliant. Unfortunately for her, she was female and more intelligent than most of her male counterparts. So you know what they do. You're full of crap. There's no way that can have anything to do with anything. Ida Rolf understood and was the first person to really eloquently describe the ways in which our fascial system determines how we view our reality. It's big. If you're living in a vacuum, if you live in a small dark room, your sensory input is less, your development is less. Moshe Feldenkrais, even before Ida Rolf, here's a fellow who's a mathematician and a physicist. He's got a funky knee, and he finds that if he moves certain ways, the knee doesn't do so well. So he's got to adjust the way that he moves so that he doesn't mess up his knee more. He establishes this idea that, hey, if we engage our movement with a mindfulness, we can compensate really well for a lot of different things going on in us. We just tend to take such things for granted. I highly recommend Feldenkrais's book, The Elusive Obvious, because he says the stuff you do regularly, you take for granted, like the way that you take a step, the way that you pick up a cup of coffee. And it says that's all stuff that's part of a really elaborate network that is involved in a lot of checks and balances in order to accomplish that. As we can engage that process mindfully, we do it better and we do it differently. Just don't do it automatically. Physical sensation is the very foundation of how our nervous system decides how it's going to be in the world. That cannot be overstated. So the ways in which we speak to our children, the foods that we feed our children, the way that we hold them, their particular difficulties because of their particular manifestation of their injury, all of those have to be taken into consideration when we start talking about what makes a safe place versus an unsafe place. If the way you're lifting that child hurts their pelvis every time that you lift them, they're not going to want you to lift them. But they may not have the wherewithal to speak that to you, and so they might just be uncomfortable, and you might notice that, and you might not notice that. We do a fair amount of musculoskeletal ultrasound at our place because most of our patients don't necessarily inform us about where they hurt and where their issues are. And there are no pediatric specialists in musculoskeletal ultrasound in the US. And so we're trying to arrange a process where we can create residencies to teach physicians how to use ultrasound. Point in fact, the other day we had a little girl in from out of the country. She's 4, she's not crawling. She had a near fatal injury now, and she's just not crawling. Her left shoulder seems guarded, and I'm feeling it. I feel a little click. There's something weird going on in there. And so you take the ultrasound, and literally takes me longer to turn the darn thing on than it does to put it on her shoulder and take a look at that left shoulder and see, oh my goodness, you have a subscapularis tear. Subscapularis is a stabilizer muscle of your rotator cuff. How does a 4-year-old get a rotator cuff tear? Well, you've seen some 4-year-olds with some pretty bad dystonia, right? Now you're going to try to put this little arm into a sleeve. Well-meaning therapists are like, oh, we're going to open these arms up. Well, all of those are things that could contribute to a tear. How does this little girl know? She doesn't have words to say that my shoulder hurts. But this shoulder is physically unable to hold her weight up. We take a little material that we got from her. We specifically put it right inside that little structure. It takes about 2 weeks. It heals. She's crawling. How else are you going to know that? Sometimes you just got to take a picture of something to know what's exactly going on. Now, the remodeling process that was going on in her brain was kicking this left arm out of the seam, right? This wasn't part of her body map because it hurts when she employs it. In your body map, every night while you sleep, every night while every one of us sleeps, we reconsolidate who we were today and who we're going to be tomorrow. That's what we do in our sleep. We take all the things that you did today and we integrate them with all the things you did last week and the week before that and the week before that. And all the weird associations that we create all get to happen in your brain. It's this beautiful place where your conscious mind and your subconscious mind get to talk to each other. There's not a lot of other places where that gets to happen. And some pretty interesting information gets to come out of that. I had a 9-year-old tell me he's having some bad dreams. I said, oh, tell me about your bad dreams. He says, I dream about the suction machine. I said, oh, the suction machine. I said, what does it do? He says, it takes my breath away. Oh, he hasn't had a suction machine for 6 years. Interesting. It stayed in his subconscious mind as something that takes his breath away. Well, that's interesting to know. He's probably not the only guy that feels that way. We're going to change every day no matter what. We're going to change every day no matter what. What you do today is going to determine who you are tomorrow. And so a question becomes, what are we adapting to? Who are we becoming? We're a very technologically oriented world. A lot of people are very invested in their technology. Understand that that's a portal into your mind. It's a portal into your child's mind. And understand that the best psychological workers in our world are attention merchants. Their job is to capture your attention and hold it for as long as possible. They're not selling your 4-year-old something today. They're selling your 4-year-old something when they're 40, and they've established the groundwork for how they feel not enough in their world and the ways in which they can purchase things that might make them feel more enough. Will that ever work? No, but somebody's going to make $1. We are revenue streams. So that trains your mind in a particular way. Our teenagers are being groomed, predatorily groomed, as in watch out for inappropriate activity later. They're being groomed by their cell phones to be better consumers. So we should be conscious of how we're adapting to the world and what those influences are in our world that we're adapting to, that we may not be paying that close of attention to because they're really convenient. There was a band in the 70s called the Dead Kennedys. They had a song called Give Me Convenience or Give Me Death. At the time, it's kind of a tongue-in-cheek sort of a thing about how people will choose convenience over survival. We live there now. So we use this term neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is an interesting phenomenon because it is the way that literally and figuratively our nervous systems are an expression of the life that we're living. Do you like your quality of life today? Good answer. If you don't, what are you going to do to make sure this isn't the quality of life you still have in 3 months? We humans adapt in 6-week cycles. That is, most bad habits can be broken in about 6 weeks. That also means that most good habits can be created in about 6 weeks. You get to choose. Most of us have no time to really think about how it is that we're adapting to the world. That also is what you're adapting to. So we understand that there's two kinds of brain plasticity. There's a functional plasticity and there's a structural plasticity. The structural plasticity is the actual way that your brain changes in response to the sensory input you have put coming into you. And so what that means ultimately is that literally we're building our nervous system based upon the experiences we have from an early age. If something happens to a certain area of your brain, the beautiful redundancy of a brain is you can recruit some other area to do that job. That's a pretty remarkable nervous system. And quite frankly, we have a very remarkable nervous system that is very compensatory and will do things that are quite surprising should we give somebody the opportunity. This is why one of our big frustrations in the way that modern medicine ends up happening is that people are told, well, here's the damage you have to your child. They'll never amount to anything. They probably won't survive past their 3rd birthday. They're certainly never going to walk. They're not going to have a job. What are you doing? You know, people get told this all the time. I'm like, how the hell do you know? Right? You're just using statistics. You know why Las Vegas can afford to pay their light bill? Because we don't listen to statistics. Logic would say, somebody's paying a lot of money for that light bill. But we all think we're going to be the big winner. We have the possibility of still being the big winner. You just might have to go about it a different way. Plasticity is experience dependent. You got to do this stuff in order to figure this stuff out. What's interesting now is that we live in a YouTube world where all of the things, the activities that you might be interested in, you can go watch a video on that. You can watch 3 videos on that. At our house, we have a policy. The policy is, if you've watched 3 YouTube videos, you've done some research. If you've watched 5 YouTube videos, now you're an expert. It's ludicrous, right? However, that is the way the world works. You have a lot of armchair authorities, people who are like, oh yeah, I understand what you have going on. They don't understand any part of it. They probably can't even spell your last name. Plasticity is going to happen. And that means that sometimes we get stuck in stressful circumstances. We learn about this from our military patients, which is literally with people who have long-term PTSD, their brain changes in shape and their amygdala gets larger, which is a particular reactive area in a nervous system. We also see this in children. We see this in kids who are in chronic pain. We see this in children who are for whatever reason, left in stressful circumstances. Some of that we have control over it, some of it we don't have control over. But if your child is hurting, if you know that every time you touch that right hip, they flinch, then assume that they're hurting. Make the assumption that something's causing some kind of distress, discomfort, or overt pain in a place. Go there first so that we can resolve the worst case scenarios and then move along. And if there's not somebody in your town that has a musculoskeletal ultrasound machine that's comfortable looking at little people's joints, then Call us, we'll help you find somebody. So this reciprocal dynamic develops millions of sensory nerves as they innervate the rest of our system, inform us about what's going on in the environment around us. And we then change how we respond to that environment. Is it safe? Is it unsafe? Now it gets really interesting, because dogs can do this. Dolphins can do this. But what we don't think they can do is think about thinking. And so at some point in time, we reach a place in our own personal development where we can have symbolic experiences. And symbolic experiences where we get to see ourselves in a different light and have epiphanies about who and where we are and how we are in the world, that also changes our brain. And sometimes that changes our brain in really, really profound ways. So the unfolding of our nervous system has a genetic blueprint that it will follow. But that genetic blueprint is flexible based upon the epigenetic phenomenon in our world. So depending on the environment you're in, you're going to unfold your nervous system differently than you would have otherwise. And just to reiterate, we're talking about tiny little microtubular structures. They're hollow. They've got a plasma membrane on the outside of them. That plasma membrane allows them to create a charge. Creating that charge allows them to then, as an action potential goes across that neuron, boom, they move all of those ions into and out of that structure, propagating a neural current. A little bit of the right kind of sensory input will get that neuron to stay. There was a lot of talk about tau proteins, especially in regards to Alzheimer's disease, and they were considered to be maybe problematic. It turns out they stabilize that microtubule for a little bit. And that then allows for the dynamic of growing these microtubules to be longer and longer structures gets to happen. And a lot of that is dependent on some blood flow. So blood flow starts our process for a lot of folks. A lot of kids with neonatal injuries, cerebral palsy, a lot of those are issues that start with blood flow concerns. And you have situations where you get a bleed or you'll get a clot. Either way causes a stroke. You have a particular area of the brain that becomes ischemic, and we call this a hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy because the brain tends to swell when that happens, right? What's interesting too is that that process of losing blood flow into the nerve causes a demyelination of those nerves. Nerves are like little wires. They're carrying information. They're carrying current. If the cord that's behind your sofa in your living room has bald spots where the copper wires are showing, and you have curtains on top of it, what happens? Your curtains might catch on fire because that current's not being contained in that wire. Our nerves are built just like that. Myelin is a product that our nerves make that goes around the outside of the neuron so that it's insulated. If you have patchy distribution, now you don't get good movement. And if the myelin is really damaged, depending on the area it is, that can contribute to seizure activity and epilepsy because the neuron that's carrying the current isn't able to contain that current, and as it hits a glitchy spot in the myelin, now it spills out of that area and affects neurons adjacent to it. So a lot of times our primary goal is just to get as much myelination back on those nerves as it is humanly possible to get as quickly as possible. Chronic exercise induces neuroplasticity. I threw this in right here mostly because for a lot of kids, their full-time job is therapy, and they might be doing more than 40 hours a week depending on the child and the week. We do some autologous therapies at our place that we are quite fond of, one of which is we will take tissues from one area of a body and we'll reallocate them to another area of a body. Namely, we'll take a portion of fat, we used to do bone marrow, and we'll extract some cellular material from that, what's called a stromal vascular fraction. These are originally what we refer to as stem cells. we live in a world now where FDA says, if somebody says stem cells, watch out because whatever they say next is a lie. And honestly, they are right. There's a lot of misinformation about this. From, hey, get an injection of stem cells and your life will be better and you'll never have a problem again, to, hey, this stuff doesn't do a darn thing. All of that may or may not be true. The fact of the matter is that in the time that we've been doing this, we are gratified to know that there's been a lot of research done to substantiate the fact that, yes, indeed, if you allocate a resource from one area of the body and you put it into a different area, it does some pretty amazing things. In this case, we refer to as mesenchymal stem cells, and they come from we derive them from fat, simply because we can get them painlessly and without any fear of causing damage somewhere. And we can then process them and put them back into a body within a couple of hours. And evidence suggests that this has an anti-inflammatory effect, it has a pro-regenerative effect, and we see some pretty interesting things happen as a result of intervention like that. It's not the end-all and be-all, right? It isn't that, hey, you put stem cells into a person and now they're just better. That may not be the case. They have to be in a place where they're actually experiencing some things that encourage their nervous system to get to a better place, right? If we put some really creative cells into you and we go stick you in a dark room, you might have just about zero happen. You've got to put them into play. You've got to create demands on the system. The demands on the system are therapy. This is our regular conversation with parents are, listen, you can buy this gadget, and you can buy that gadget, and you can do this thing, and you can do that thing. At the end of the day, here's what works for people. Therapy. Therapy. The day-to-day. Hey, let's see if we can put one foot in front of the other today. That's asking a lot depending on the person. But that's the simplicity of it, right? Our job is to get them to the place where they can do some therapy and they can get some value from that therapy because now this nervous system's in a place where it can remodel. But make no mistake, it takes a lot of work to get a person to that really good place. And I know that none of you are strangers to that idea. And I think that when people have not gone through this kind of a process, they're frankly surprised at just how much effort it actually does take. And if you're a single parent, holy cow, that's a lot on that one person. And so what's beautiful about a community like this is there's automatic supports within the community, you know? We have families that live next to each other so that they can care for each other's children if somebody needs to go get groceries, you know? Things that other people might take for granted. So we see that stem cell therapy, which is a lot of things and means a lot of different things, is really becoming more and more proven therapy for helping a nervous system resolve chronic trauma and inflammation. On this particular slide, because this was the paper that I took it from, they also talk about something called PEA luteolin with stem cells, which is great. We'll talk a little bit about PEA. And we also recognize that, and you know, don't remember this, but there are some very specific ways in which neurogenesis can happen in a brain. It doesn't matter whose brain, it doesn't matter where. We know that there are locations that are fraught with the ability to do this thing versus other locations that may not be able to accomplish this objective. And so we call these things this subventricular zone. And we have acronyms for things like BDNF, which is a brain-derived neurotropic growth factor, and VEGF, which is a vascular endothelial growth factor. And don't remember any of that other than to know that there's a lot of redundancy in the way that a body calls for things that are high energy. And rebuilding nervous systems is high energy. You've got to have a blood supply in there as well as new neurons. As the neurons get more and more active now, you need more of a blood supply. And this has got to be a process that kind of keeps on unfolding based upon the demands placed on the person. Always based on the demands placed on the person. So originally we thought, hey, you can put some cells in there and they'll replace some other cells and voila. It's not that simple. We also understand that there's a gene transfer from new cells that we migrate into another area, so that has an impact on how those cells that are already there get to respond. Pretend you're an embryo. You're basically a basketball of cells with a liquid center. And these cells over here, they're going to become a brain. And these cells over here are going to become a liver. And these cells over here, well, they're going to start creating a skeleton. How do they know? You got a ball of the same cells. How do they know you're going to become a liver over here and a brain over here? Modern medicine has no idea. We've got some hypotheses. Number one is it's adjacency. Adjacency is who you're next to determines who you're going to be. But how did who you're next to determine who they were going to be? Well, they determine how they're going to be based upon over here being who they're going to be. And so there is this amazing potential that we don't even know how it unfolds in terms of how certain cells get to become certain kinds of tissues. But we do know that there is this thing called homology. And it is that depending on where you derive those primordial cells, and every tissue in our body has some primordial cell associated with it, and some of those primordial cells can jump over and become this kind, and some of them can jump over and become this kind. But not all of them can do that. And so part of the growing understanding is where you derive those cells determines what their capacity might be in that person and how that might work for somebody. In our case, here again, we like the fat cells because they also come with a ready fuel supply, because the fat is kind of what feeds those guys. This is a very complicated picture that mostly reiterates this idea that there is a pattern of remodeling that our nervous system goes through, and to the degree that we can understand that pattern of remodeling, we can assist it when it starts faltering or it starts going left when we would like it to go right. And to the degree that we can look at somebody, examine somebody, have a conversation with the parents as to, okay, here's what's happening after we did this thing. Now you can adjust and modify that. It is absolutely not a one-size-fits-all process. Every single human being requires something a little bit different. We live in a world where modern medicine wants there to be one-size-fits-all answers for people because there's big money in that, right? The entire pharmaceutical industry is based on this idea that, hey, everybody who's got this diagnosis takes this drug. And yet, all of the studies that we see that show what is the efficacy of these agents, they are about 40%. So when the drug is prescribed for the desired outcome, it's about 40% of effective. Placebo is 35%. So what are we doing? So understand that when you're given a prescription for something like baclofen, that works just about 40% of the time. So if you're taking this thing and you find that you're outside the sweet spot, which for most children is 20 milligrams a day, and they say to you, well, I think we should go to 40. You're not going to make any gains at 40. That's been scientifically proven by the company that makes the drug. They want you to put a pump in so that you have consistent administration. Listen, if you're not responding to 20, you ain't responding to the pump. And that's some ugly scar tissue that you got to take care of when you get that pump removed. If you haven't seen that, it's pretty grisly because it goes right into your spine. Just things that we consider in the process of decision making. We don't want to make a person any worse than they already are in the process of seemingly help them get to a better place. Platelet-rich plasma is another body tissue that we reallocate for other purposes. Basically, this is a blood sample. You pull it up, you spin it down in a particular way to concentrate some platelets. Platelets contain some platelet-derived growth factor. Turns out that stem cells, whatever that might be, are tissues that respond to trauma. If you get rolled by a bear or you get into a car accident and you have all kinds of bodily trauma, how does your body take care of that? Well, you'll mobilize some of those local stem cells to become part of those tissues and heal that area. But sometimes we got to use some kind of a trauma messenger to get those cells to a place that we want them to be in. And PRP is a really great way to do that. This is a currency of trauma. These are platelets, which are what show up when you cut yourself and make a scab. And so the platelets, as we put them into play, they guide these other cells into areas that they may not be inclined to go to in the first place. In the case of kids that have had brain injuries, maybe they had that brain injury when they were born, maybe they had, trauma from a near-fatal drowning. Long after the fact, that particular trauma is not there any longer. So now the motivation to remodel that area is less. So you put some platelets in, deliver them to that particular area. Now we've increased the ability of a body to start remodeling that particular area. And we find that when we add those to a tissue transplant of other kinds, it accelerates that. It makes that work a lot better. In this case, if you're going to take a fat sample or a bone marrow sample and you mix it with some PRP, it definitely makes it work a lot better. For a lot of our kids, what we do is we'll do a transplant, and then 3 months later we'll have them come back for a PRP, and usually we'll see more response after the PRP than we do even the cells, basically because the PRP is giving them something to do. Every one of these cells, these neurons, have a cell membrane around it. That cell membrane is made up of some phospholipids. Phospholipids are a interesting molecule that is partially polar and partially nonpolar. The legs of the phospholipid are fatty acids, and they will orient themselves so that they are the inside of what we call a phospholipid bilayer. That's what these guys are, bilayers. So basically, you have the heads on the outside because they're polar, they're water soluble. You have the tails on the inside, and they are not water soluble, they're fat soluble. And then you have these membrane spanning proteins, which are the important part of how you're able to create a current. This is what you make myelin from. And specifically, one of these members of the family, phosphatidylserine, is specifically what becomes myelin and makes myelin that's soft and supple and doesn't break when you move. We have two classes of phospholipids. Phosphatidylcholine is the most common one. This is lecithin. Lecithin is in a lot of different products. Nestle creates a market for lecithin. Turns out lecithin makes some darn good chocolate milk. If you add some cacao in there and you mix it with some milk and some phosphatidylcholine, it'll mix really well. It makes fat-soluble stuff mix in water-soluble stuff. And it makes water-soluble stuff mix in fat-soluble stuff. And so it's a pretty nifty molecule. It's also at the interface of us and the outside world, and that's how we contain the stuff that should be in us, and the stuff that should be out of us, we keep out of us. And then we can selectively let things in because we have these membrane-spanning proteins. Phosphatidylcholine in our membranes is also a source of choline. Choline is the #1 most important neurotransmitter for neuromuscular control. For our children, for our patient base, this is neurotransmitter #1 for us. It's also the first neurotransmitter that was ever discovered, and it is also the most abundant neurotransmitter in our entire bodies. Acetylcholine is involved in how muscles contract and how they relax. And we need choline, probably more than we are getting. Phosphatidylserine is a member of the family that has, instead of just choline in the head, it has serine. Serine is a particular amino acid with an affinity for the brain. And phosphatidylserine is a preparation that you can go down to your local health food store and you can purchase. I encourage you to do so. There is one company that has the license to make phosphatidylserine, and that is Lucas Meyer. So most of the products that you'll see out there came from the same place. Ultimately, they'll add other things to it. Buy it and eat it. It's good for you, and see what it does for your brain, and then feed it to your child and see what it does for their brain. If you bring them to my place, I'm going to feed this to them in one way or another. We're going to get this into them because this makes a difference. It also does this interesting thing where it decreases seizure frequency. We have an ongoing, sometimes life is layered, and so a lot of our families have small dogs. Sometimes small dogs have tendencies towards epilepsy. We are now have a streak over the last 5 years where pretty much when the families come in and they say, my dog has seizures, and we feed them phosphatidylserine, those dogs stop having seizures. It takes 100 milligrams a day for a small dog. That's just fun. If it works in your dog, it's worth trying in your toddler. Perfectly safe. Because it's kind of somewhere between fat and water soluble, sometimes a little hard to digest. So if we're having some acid issues, we're having some digestive issues, don't pop it in right away. Let's try to resolve that a little bit more. Palmitoyl oil ethanolamide, PEA, is a cannabinoid, so it's kind of a cousin to cannabis, to THC and CBD. It doesn't do those things necessarily, but it is in us naturally. It's an endocannabinoid. It is also wildly anti-inflammatory and nicely fat-soluble. And so it gets into the central nervous system and reduces inflammation. There are precious few things in this world that'll do that without some trade-off. PEA's trade-off is sometimes it causes a little bit of constipation. We can work that. We add a little magnesium hydroxybutyrate to it. It works beautifully. You can buy this at your local health food store. You can buy this on the internet. Try to get a good quality product and eat it. Eat it yourself. Do you give things to your children that you haven't eaten yourself? That's right. You shouldn't. You should eat everything that your children eat so that you know how they feel. I had a dad who swallowed it took some convincing. He's like, I don't know. I don't feel comfortable with this. I said, just take one. You just take one. I said, this is a child's dose. What's the worst that could happen with this particular pill? So he takes it, he comes back, he says, that messed me up for 3 days. I said, that's right. It did mess you up for 3 days. He says, how does my daughter do therapy on this? What a good question. What a good question. I said, how does your daughter do therapy on this? How would you do with therapy on this? Eat it. See what it feels like. Life is an experiential effect, right? We are not separate from our children. They are a product of us, right? When you taste that formula, what's it taste like? Ugh, this stuff smells gross. I would never taste it. Really? Under any other circumstance in life through the history of humankind, did people say, this smells bad, I'm going to feed it to my kid? It's artificial. If it doesn't taste right, it's not right. We got a tongue for a reason, right? We've skewed our palates. We like sweet, creamy things way too much. And that shows in our buffet lines. However, when we calibrate our sensory system to the experiences of our lives, we get to have a different experience of our lives. When I was a chemist for Procter & Gamble, one of the things that they needed was people who would taste the product coming off the line. Full disclosure, I was working in a plant where we were making Metamucil. No one wants to take doses of Metamucil all day because, you might have some work to get done and you might be preoccupied. And so they sent us to organoleptic training. Organoleptic training, that's where people who are professional tasters and smellers get to go. Like the wine tasters, the people who work at the breweries and taste the beers. We have a huge shamrock plant in Phoenix. So the people who are like making up new flavors of ice cream and deciding if the flavored ice cream is the right flavor and what have you. That's what their jobs are. You're all going to this little organoleptic training program and everyone's asking, oh, what do you do? And what do you do? And I'm like, we make Metamucil. And they're like, I'm glad I don't have that job, says the cheese-making guy. So, organoleptically, you're taught that certain tastes mean something, right? Bitter things mean poison, but we should have a little bit of bitter in our diet. And we should have a wide-ranging diet full of lots of different flavors. The structure of the plasma membrane allows for these transmembrane proteins to come across, and these are the channels through which the ions flow when a current goes across a neuron. The quality of the protein involved in making these receptors makes a difference also. The NMDA receptor is a particular receptor that we talk about a lot because it is heavily involved in seizure activity. It's heavily involved in dystonic movements and spasticity. NMDA receptors are involved also in the formation of memory. And we understand that certain agents can ride on an NMDA receptor in an excitotoxic kind of a way. So take, for example, monosodium glutamate, MSG. Some people have an issue with that. Some people don't have an issue with that. For some people, they'll get a headache and they'll get agitated and irritable. And other people, it won't affect them at all. Some people, it'll give them seizures. And some people, it just doesn't do a thing. It tastes good on your Chinese food. And so what's the difference between one person having a strong response and another person not? Is this level of receptive ability for that particular protein. And there are things that will affect it. So for example, MSG or glutamate, as our bodies make it, increases a certain amount of activity on the nerves so that if you're making this flush of connections, when you have a little glutamate on board and then NMDA receptors are fired up, now more of those connecting neurons that wouldn't previously have had enough current to get them to stay, now they stay. So there is a benefit in that. You're able to have more remodeling happen more rapidly. You've got to be able to put that into play, otherwise it won't stay usable, but there is a beneficial effect of that. For some of us, we don't turn that off as well. And when we don't turn it off, then that excitotoxic element keeps on going. And that's what conspires to make a person have a headache or some kind of a seizure activity. Glutamate is huge also in terms of how does a nervous system determine that your world is a safe place or an unsafe place. When we blockade the NMDA receptor, we just shut the thing down, thoughts spin in your head. More thoughts than you can iterate with your mouth. And you can have hallucinations and psychosis when that happens also. And a lot of these agents that are psychedelic drugs that people like and have a street value, that's what they do, is they basically shut down what's called the default mode network, and they make it so that you're sort of spinning on your own thoughts. Maybe there's epiphanies that come out of that, and maybe there's not. But you are having a symbolic experience that does indeed affect your remodeling. We understand also this NMDA receptor is heavily involved in a near-death experience. The one thing that most of our kids have in common is they've all had a near-death experience. Have you? If you haven't had that experience, it is enlightening and it changes who you are in the world. And it's out of the near-death experience that some part of this survival response gets to come. And these NMDA receptors are heavily involved in that. But that near-death experience is really tightly wound up into a trauma experience. And so whatever conglomeration of thoughts and ideas and experiences are there, you cannot expect a 2-year-old to figure out. You can't even expect a 40-year-old to figure it out, right? It's inside of us, and we don't have a way to sort that in an appropriate way. So the best we can do is modulate the activity of those receptors so that as time goes and as some of it comes up little by little, we can help process that as it happens. Things like glycine. Glycine is cheaper than dirt, looks like sugar and tastes like sugar. We put it in kids' water bottles because it's Arizona and you can have a water bottle all day long in school because it's abusive not to. Not that kids drink water, unfortunately. Glycine makes our water taste a little sweet. Glycine settles down an area of your brain called the locus coeruleus. The locus coeruleus is the area of your brain that creates norepinephrine. Norepinephrine is your number one reason why people have seizures. Norepinephrine is an excitatory neurotransmitter. It's made from dopamine, and its presence is an alert. It is, hey, things are not safe in your world, be aware. This is an issue with kids that have attention deficit disorder because they aren't able to glean what's a foreground and what's a background, right? You're 10 years old and you're sitting in math class and there's some guy walking his dog outside your window. What's more interesting? Hey, that dog is peeing on that tree. That is what's more interesting. What glycine does is it also binds to an NMDA receptor. It has a pacifying effect on it for the most part, and it helps it control. And so for kids with attention deficit disorder, we're not medicating them, we're just taking an edge off. Most of those kids don't need to be medicated. They just need an edge taken off. And then we just got to talk about the rest of their life as to why they have an edge. Mostly it's because, like, you know, you're a 10-year-old boy and somebody wants you to sit in a chair all day long at a desk in a room with a bunch of other people, and what you'd really rather be doing is fishing. Lycopodium is a club moss, and it creates this, Herperzia is the new name, serrata. Huperzine is also an NMDA receptor agent and improves mental functioning. You should get some and try it. These are things that are relatively inexpensive. They're at your corner health food store. Eat them. And then feed them to your child after you've determined that this is a safe thing and it does good things for you, and then see how it works for your child. See, what we're doing is we're trying to open a box. You have medically complicated children. You stay with the formula, you stay with the medications. Don't deviate, because if they get worse, it's your fault. And there's a fear structure that's involved in people being compliant. If the process you're doing is getting you to the place you want to be, then keep doing that process. If you want more, if it's not happening the way that you want it to happen, and you want something more for your child, then do more. Eat some things yourself. Start eating the things that they're taking and ask yourself this question: how is this affecting their recovery? Because humans have a lot more potential than we give them credit for being. Augmentine, if you step foot in my office at some point in time in your life, I have sent you home with augmentine. Because this is a decarboxylated arginine. Arginine is an amino acid that's very helpful for increasing nitrous oxide production in the nervous system, which then in turn gets better blood flow into the synapses. Arginine has a little bit of a problem, and that is it feeds a certain family of viruses. Those viruses cause cold sores and genital herpes. People don't want that. You got to have the virus, but then it lets it express itself more. But if you take the carboxylic acid part off of that compound, it stays very functional, does the same kind of stuff, but no longer feeds viruses. So we really like augmentine a lot for that reason. If a person has to be on a mood stabilizer like lithium, we find that augmentine makes lithium work a lot better. The problem with lithium is it's very toxic. And so if you can go to a lesser dose, if instead of 300 milligrams twice a day for your lithium dose, you can do 150 milligrams once a day, and still maintain the changes, your kidneys will thank you over the long term. Augmentine's available at your local health food store. You can buy it by the kilo on the internet. It's cheap. Buy some. Eat it. It increases blood flow to the periphery of your body. Take a bunch before you go work out. Your blood pressure's going to drop, but boy, will you get pumped. As our football players say, you're going to be swolled. Schisandra is a berry. There's this thing about food to drugs, right? Between food and drugs, we have herbs and amino acids. They're more than food. They're more specific than food, but they're not quite as toxic and problematic as drugs. I mean, they can be. You can take too much of anything, right? Schisandra is a wonderful berry that has been long used in botanical medicine. It's also just eaten as a berry, but it has this astringent effect on the bowel when you taste it. It's sort of like, astringent is like something that wants water but hates it. It dries out your tongue and makes you feel like it's astringed, puckered. And in Chinese medicine, there's this idea that Schisandra berries act as an astringent to your soul. When you're spread too thin, and you have tendrils too many places in your world, Schisandra kind of helps consolidate you and bring you back in. What I say to people is, see if that's true for you. Eat it. When your child is going to a lot of therapy, they're overwhelmed and life is overwhelming, feed them some Schisandra berries. They taste good. They like them. This astringency is interesting. It's also a 5-flavor berry. That means that if you pay attention, there are 5 flavors in there. Try to pick them out. Make it an experience. Make it a sensory experience. Valerians, these are really ubiquitous plants. They're all over the world. They all smell a little bit like dirty feet. They all have a reputation for wanting to put people to sleep. Some percentage of people don't go to sleep. They get really more hyper off of them. However, these valerian plants are really great for pacifying a freaked out nervous system and helping dystonic tissues find a place of relaxation. They do work on a benzodiazepine receptor, but they're not really benzodiazepines. They're not going to knock you out like that. Vacha is a little rush. It grows in ponds the world over, and it's the root of this particular plant that's used commonly in Ayurveda for over 2,000 years, as they've documented. They've used this for kids with epilepsy and people that have had madness, people who have had neurologic problems, trauma to their brain. And it does a great job of helping to reduce seizure activity. It also blockades NMDA activity, so it helps increase symbolic experiences. Bacopa moniere is also an Ayurvedic plant that has over a 2,000-year history. It's a low-growing little plant that my turkeys and my goats really love. It grows around, we have a couple of ponds, in the desert, it's hard to get anything to grow. Bacopa grows really, really well. And so I keep thinking, wow, those goats and those turkeys any day should start talking. Bacopa is a swampy plant, so sometimes it doesn't taste so great. However, it's not impossible to consume, and is a pretty interesting agent. It contains some L-dopa, so a lot of times with movement disorders, one of our goals is to get more dopamine on board, and this is one of our primary ways that can happen. Panax is ginseng. You sell this in gas stations the world over. Buy it, eat it, see what you think. N-acetylcysteine is an amino acid that is particularly great at helping a person who has a compromised airway stop having a compromised airway. N-acetylcysteine becomes a component of mucus. It's a sulfur-containing amino acid. We use it when our kids were young and they'd get sick with some sniffles or something. We generally give them some N-acetylcysteine. My kids refer to it as the fart pills. And so even to this day, as adults, they still call them fart pills, because when you open the bottle, you'll be like, oh, I'm supposed to eat this? However, it is wildly antibacterial, and as it becomes a component of your mucus, especially if you've got an endemic Pseudomonas situation, this can be magical. And we have several kids who've now resolved their Pseudomonas infections, which isn't supposed to happen because we get to add this to it. Hericium is a mushroom that grows wild through the forests of North America and is amazingly great for your brain. Buy some, eat it, get it fresh, cook it up for dinner, make it into a tea, buy some dried stuff, see if you can tell a difference between the qualities of the different products out there. There's companies that grow this on oat fiber, and then they naturally grow on like birch trees. Like, I'll bet it's different if you grow it on a birch tree. Ask the questions. This is the thing that I love a lot about botanical medicine, is that here we have this sensory-oriented process, right? All these things have strong flavors, have strong history of being used with human beings. And they're safe. Eat them. Try them yourselves. Have that experience. Share it with your child. Because neuroplasticity is really about how do we share the events of our lives with our loved ones. We aren't suggesting that intermittent fasting is something you should do with your child. However, if you have a 3-year-old, they're already doing this. Traveling, mnemonic devices, learn a musical instrument. We have a little guy, he's on the autistic spectrum. He's in a wheelchair. He doesn't have to be, he chooses this. We're working on that. This kid can play every Beatles song that you can imagine on an acoustic guitar that he goes everywhere with him. And you just mention the song and he doesn't even think about it. He just starts playing it. That's pretty incredible. My nervous system doesn't do that. And I think to myself, how does that happen? We are pretty miraculous, this human condition. Using your non-dominant hand. Brush your teeth with your left hand for a while, Create artwork. Take an art class. Get your kids into an art class. Whether you think they can do it or not, doesn't matter. It's them having that experience, right? Being enmeshed in it. Dancing, sleeping better. There are only really three things that any one of us can absolutely control in our lives, and we owe Candace Pert a huge debt for this understanding, which is what we eat, how we move, and how we think. That's what we can control. You can't control what the bozos in Washington, D.C. are going to do with whatever, right? You don't get to control that. You get a vote, and you can make that vote count in whatever way you want to. But the truth of the matter is, here are the three things that you absolutely can control in your own life. And it's also the things that we would like our children to begin to control as well. Here again, if you're living with 3-year-olds, they want to control everything. So mindfulness, this idea that Moshe Feldenkrais kind of brings to bear, which is this idea that, hey, when you take a step, there's a lot of things you take for granted in taking that step. Let's break it down. Let's break it down into some fundamental pieces. Let's become really mindful about every little thing that you're doing in order to engage this process, right? You guys have heard of this guy, Wayne Gretzky, right? Largely considered one of the greatest hockey players ever to take the ice. And then once he retired from being a player, he went on to be a coach. His father lives in our neck of the woods. He cleans people's hockey equipment. And his father says, this is the wisdom of somebody whose child is a superstar, right? He says, sometimes the people who play the sport really well, naturally, aren't the best people to teach other people how to play that sport well. He says, it's the guy who's really bad at this and has to really struggle and try to figure it out piece by piece is really good at teaching other people who can put that together that same way. And if they have more raw talent than the person teaching them, then they will do really well with that. But if you get a superstar and you want them to become a coach, they may not be a coach, right? They may be just a really great superstar. Think about that in your own life. You're a superstar in whatever you're doing in your life, right? Getting up out of bed, going to the bathroom, coming back to bed. For somebody who has a mobility issue, that's a lot and might take them all morning. You might do that in about 6 minutes. That's a superstar move, right? And we take it for granted. Well, because we got to go and we don't have time to think about this, right? Mindfulness thing. But our children are watching us. They're seeing what we do. They want to do what we do. This is the beauty of children, right? Like our adults, they're messed up. The adults with neurological issues, they got all kinds of things. You know, this conversation we had the other day with a fellow, if my seizures don't come back, does that mean I got to go back to work? It does actually mean that you'll probably have to do something like that, right? Secondary gains. Oh, all right. You know, if I get rid of this situation, do I stop the opiates? Yeah, you would stop those opiates. Huh, all right. Maybe people get better and maybe people don't. We get too smart for our own good and we start feeding into our secondary gains. This nervous system that we have is a product of a long time. Our ancestors and the activities that they did created the nervous systems that they had that we inherit from them. They're still in us. They're part of us. They are part of who you are, where you come from, right? It's part of a home, kind of a sense. Sensorially, we live indoors too much. We are too much in front of our phones. We have this amazing sensory system that can identify a lot of interesting things in the world. You know, we're almost as good at dogs at sniffing things. There's actually a place up in British Columbia, Canada, where they'll do a certain kind of organoleptic testing where they get you down on the ground, they make a trail, it's chocolate, and then you are to, in this football field, follow this trail of chocolate with your nose. And people at first are like, I'm not doing this. And then you make it a competition and you see who does it better. This is the thing about humans. As soon as you make it a competition, now people will do absurd things. and so then people become really good at identifying certain smells with their nose. And then following that smell in the grass. The best part of the whole program are the videos. But proving humans have a really wonderful sense of smell, we just don't calibrate ourselves to it. It's like, oh, that stinks, don't go there. Ooh, that smells good, give me some more of that. That's how we work it. There's not much subtlety to it. However, if we allow that subtlety to come in, do some training as in, hey, I'm tasting this one and I'm tasting that one and I like the way this is and I don't like the way that is. And try to identify what it is that you like about a thing. It's the same thing when you're putting that little drop of pickle juice on that, on your 4-year-old's tongue, and they're like, ooh, they got the face. That's sensory input. Whatever neurons in that moment were subtly connected and just needed a little bit more of a nudge to stay connected, that pickle juice did it. A lemon juice did it. A hug did it. A kind word did it. A reassurance. That's what does it. There's also wonder and awe. This is one of my favorite petroglyphs. This comes out of a place in the southwest that's between Sedona and Cottonwood, and in a place called Palatka. Palatka has been in continuous use for 12,000 years. And there's a grotto there, the Yavapai people still use it for ceremonies and tradition. There's this big pool of water under a cave overhang, and it's really a very, very incredible place that inspires wonder and awe, because you think to yourself, holy cow, what were people doing hanging out here 10,000, 12,000 years ago, drawing stuff on the walls? Wonder and awe is a primary driver of neuroplasticity. Wonder and awe are what inform the religious impulse in human beings. It's what creates a certain kind of encouragement, but also helps us establish safety and unsafety in our world. It's just a matter of kind of figuring out, how do we cultivate awe and wonder in our world? Well, sometimes it's just go outside and sit in the grass. Some bugs will start crawling on you and then start asking some questions. I wonder what bugs these are. I wonder how this works. Look at how this tree has this network of roots that go through this grass, and holy cow, there's mushrooms popping up all over the base of this tree. I wonder, are they there all the time? Just ask them the questions, like children do, right? The magic school bus. The woman that runs the magic school bus, her motto is, the best way to learn is to make mistakes and get messy. There's truth in that. So neuroplasticity, as we talk about, is a part of a lot of factors. Number one of those factors is, what kind of environment are you living in? Does your system feel like you're in a safe place, or does your system feel like you're in an unsafe place? If you love that therapist, whenever you go and it goes well, that's going to be a whole different experience than, hey, I don't like this therapist for whatever reason. And kids are fickle that way. You know, it very much is a personality kind of a process. But we have to honor that in them, right? Because it's their personality. And as fickle as they may or may not be, it still is them. And guess what? They get a choice. And it's important for them to have that choice, because having choice also facilitates neuroplasticity. And so with that, I thank you all for your kind attention. And if you have questions, please, we'll work that. Fantastic. Have a wonderful conference.